How would you say I'm not used to that work?
Na clapist leis an obair.
Welcome to Ní Ansa, Not Difficult in Old Irish. This is the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. My name is Nina Knockaert-Guillou and I'm an O'Donovan postdoctoral scholar here in the school. Today I'm talking to Seán Ó Hoireabhárd, another O'Donovan scholar here also in the School of Celtic Studies. So we talk about his recent book, The Medieval Irish Kings and the English Invasion, and his innovative approach to history research. He tells us more about what a historian of medieval Ireland actually does every day, and where he gets all the information to understand medieval Irish kings. So without further ado, let's dive into Seán's fascinating research. Hi Seán, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Nina, thanks very much for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. So Seán, you're an O'Donovan scholar here at the School of Celtic Studies in the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. But how did you get here? What did you study in college? And kind of how did you get interested in medieval Irish history in the first place?
Sure, so I've always been interested in Irish history and medieval Irish history. But I suppose to make a longer version of it, I did history and Muraíle for my degree in Maynooth. And while I was doing that degree, I took a summer job as a tour guide in Trimcastle, and while I was there, I learned a lot from the other guides about the English invasion of Ireland in the 12th century, and the sort of the whole historical period around that. And I took an interest in it. And when I went on to do my master's in Irish history, I focused on a particular incident that occurred around the time Trimcastle was being built, and so that's how I ended up specialising in 12th century.
Right, very good. And so you were doing your undergrad in Maynooth then, and did you do your master's in Maynooth as well? Or?
Yeah, that's right. So I stayed loyal to Maynooth. You know, I did my degree, I did my master's, and I did my PhD in Maynooth. I mean, Maynooth was very good to me. I got a lot of support there. I was initially supervised by Dr Coleman Etchingham until he retired in 2019, and then I was taken on. I was adopted by Dr Elizabeth Boyle and Dr Michael Potterton. So I think those are people that your listeners will definitely know and be familiar with their work. So obviously I had some great supervision while I was there.
Yeah, very good. So from then you kind of moved to the big city, is it, to become a postdoctoral scholar here at DIA. So what is your current project?
Right, so I still work on the 12th century Irish kingdoms. We're going to talk a little bit about my book, I know, in a while, and I sort of work on a kind of follow-up project to that now, talking about the early English lordships as successor states of the medieval Irish kingdoms, how they mirrored the Irish kingdoms in terms of their setup. And I also look at Irish queens and queenships. So as you say, I'm an O'Donovan scholar here. Those are the 3-year positions here at the Institute. And I've been here for 2.5 years now at the moment. So I'm coming towards the end of my time here. But it's been very productive and very enjoyable. And also part of my remit has been to get the book out. So that's been part of my work here as well. Yeah.
Very good. So yeah, I guess for listeners who might not know what a person like you does day to day, what does a normal day as a medieval Irish historian look like?
Normal day as a medieval Irish historian involves a lot of reading and probably less writing than one would wish. You would imagine that there would be a good bit of writing done, but actually day to day it's more so about reading, making sure that you have sources in order, that you have that you've read everything that has been written about a particular topic that you're dealing with, so that you're up to date with the historiography, and gradually then a little bit of writing as well. And as you know, here at the Institute as well, we take classes and seminars on the language and the manuscripts of the time period that we deal with, so that we undertake translations for those seminars as well. So depending on what day of the week it is and whether there are seminars, my work would either be doing translations for those seminars, or reading and writing for my own research projects.
Very good. Right. So I guess moving on now to the kind of big research output that you've had this year, a big fat book that you published earlier this year with Liverpool University Press, entitled The Medieval Irish Kings and the English Invasion. So maybe just to start, can you tell us in a few words what is the book about? You talked a little bit about your research, but this particular volume.
Yeah, so the book is very much what it says on the tin, right? So it's about the English invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. Some people might be more familiar with that under the title of the Anglo-Norman or the Norman invasion. But there have been arguments against those names in the past, and most historians now would agree that we should call it the English invasion. So it's about that invasion in the 12th century. A more general audience might be familiar with a sort of phrase that's used of Irish history, that the English have been here for 800 years or so on, and that this research project goes right back to the beginning of that period and looks at the Irish kingdoms, specifically the provincial Irish kingdoms, and how they were behaving for about 100 years before the event and for about 100 years after the event. So how did the invasion impact their political behaviour and their political trajectories? Some of the kingdoms survived and some of them didn't. So one of the key questions then that was asked was, why was that the case? What kind of policies led to survival and what kind of policies led to their conquest? And then there's also the question of the Kingship of Ireland, or the High Kingship of Ireland, the title whereby one of these kings was recognised as the superior over the others. And part of the research project was to explain what that office was like at that time. And again, people may be aware that the last King of Ireland, or the last High King of Ireland, Rory or Conchobair, or Rory O'Connor in the anglicised version, his reign is at the time of the English invasion as well. So that's partly what it's concerned with.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So you did mention that you kind of focused on the invasion before and after, and putting this invasion, with the date traditionally given is 1169, right in the middle of your research, really, of the book. And many scholars before, as you say in the introduction, have used this as a beginning or an end to studies and to kind of time definitions of time periods. So can you tell us more about why you decided to put 1169 at the heart of your time period? Right,
yeah, exactly. So as you say, the predominant way of doing this is to either finish at the point of the invasion or to begin at the point of an invasion. And I suppose I would say, first of all, that there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. I mean, the invasion itself does create a sort of different historical era that comes after it. But the problem from my point of view is that when everybody does this, it solidifies the idea of a complete change in the landscape, whereas there are lots of continuities across the invasion as well. And so I think it works better as historians if we don't all follow exactly the same historiographical demarcations when we work on these periods. If we can try and change it slightly, everyone will be able to bring something fresh, something original. And in this case, the idea was the Irish kingdoms in the longue durée, and with a focus on continuity, recognising the fact that there is a lot of change, but focusing in this case on the continuity that was there as well.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you go about deciding kind of a beginning and an end for your own study then? Right,
so exactly. So then the question becomes, if you're not going to use the traditional start and end points, what ones are you going to use? So the answer is a little bit flexible, because I didn't use any single starting point for any of the provincial kingdoms or any single end point, depending on the reigns of particular kings, particular battles or events that happened. I finished or started in a slightly different place for each of the kingdoms that I looked at. So roughly around 1100 to around 1250, but depending on what was happening, I I either shortened it or lengthened it. So it's arbitrary, but all of these demarcations are arbitrary. And the problem, as I say again, is if everyone is doing the same ones, you create the impression that there's no other way of doing it.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a very reasonable way to approach the subject. And you also make a very good point in the introduction that your work aims to, and I quote, understand the Irish kingdoms on their own terms. And you said this earlier. And so you argue for a post-colonial approach, which would restore the agency to the Irish kings and place emphasis on the invaded and the colonized. And so I just wanted to maybe, can you tell us more about this kind of approach to historical research, and also how does that fit within the field of history in general? Is that something that people use often, and why? And what's the general context for post-colonial?
Yeah, so people might be more familiar with post-colonialism from literary studies, but I suppose it's an intellectual framework that arises in the mid-20th century with the retreat of the large European empires, and people start to challenge the received wisdom in terms of the way the world is viewed in all sorts of different disciplines, and to place particular emphasis on the people who have been the victims in this conception of colonialism, right? So not the beneficiaries as they might have been seen according to a previous colonialist mindset. And with regard to history, the application of this theory in history would see a focus on not the people who colonized a particular area, but the people who were the conquered. And in Ireland, we have the establishment of the English colony, and the focus again on that later historical period tends to go with a focus on the colony and the colonists, their development, their successes, with a sort of disregard for the Gaelic Irish. And this is a style of telling the story of the English invasion that actually arises right from the very beginning. So the great early chroniclers of the English invasion of Ireland, Giraldus, Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, uses this technique where he talks about Diarmait Mac Murchada, the Irish king, up to the point of the invasion, and then he doesn't talk very much about the Irish kings after that. He talks about the colonists. And actually this approach has remained popular right up to the present day. So in terms of applying post-colonial theory to medieval Ireland, the idea is to retain a focus on the Gaelic Irish and the sources that they produced, right? So the Irish have their own source types. Specifically, I was concerned more so with the Irish Annals than any other particular genre of source, but there are all sorts of other sources as well. So it's not a case, as some people might assume, that there are only English sources for what's going on in Ireland in this period. On the contrary, you also have Gaelic Irish sources. It's a question for professional historians in terms of how they're specialising, how they're using their sources, what sources that they're choosing to concentrate on. And in my case, the decision was made to focus on Irish sources, specifically the Irish Annals, and maintain a deliberate focus on the Irish kingdoms, in the hope that it would balance the historiography somewhat, which is still skewed towards the development of the colony. That's a long answer, but I hope it's...
No, that's really interesting. And so when you talk about Irish and Gaelic Irish sources, do you mean sources in Irish, or do you mean sources produced by those, the Irish kingdoms and the Irish kings?
So the answer is we have sources in both Irish and in Latin, from this period, but I again focus predominantly on sources in Irish, specifically in Middle Irish, which is the period of the language from 900 to about 1200. We have poetry, saga literature, annals to record. We also have charters, which are mostly in Latin, but we also have records of land grants in Irish, some of which are preserved in the Book of Kells, actually, and a variety of other source types that we draw on. And also, just because I focus on the Irish kingdoms and have made a deliberate decision in regards to the sources, doesn't mean that I disregard evidence from English sources either, and sources in Latin coming from England or from elsewhere. Some some even in Norman French. So you can use all of that evidence to build up a picture of the Irish kingdom. So while the predominant focus is there, and most of the information in relation to the Irish kingdoms is in Gaelic Irish sources, there is also information to be learned in other source types as well. I'm less concerned with the, say, manuscript materials compared to some other people who work in Celtic studies.
Yeah. And that clearly demands a good command of the early language of, Latin as well, and you mentioned Norman French. So do you engage with these sources kind of in the flesh, the originals, or are there available editions? How do you go about finding these sources?
I know happily there are editions for almost everything, and linguists have gone to the trouble of translating them accurately into English. I have Irish and some Latin. I don't have Norman French, for example, so I'm reliant on the editions that are produced for those sources. For a historian, it's always best to be able to read the sources in their original language. It's not always possible for simply because of the variety of source materials that you will use. But yes, it's always better to get close to the source, because some of the sources that we work with, the editions that we have for them are up to 150 years old. In fact, one source, one set of Annals has an edition that when I was doing this project, the most recent edition was from the 16th century, right? The Annals of Clonmacnoise. So that was recently superseded by in an edition by Nollaig or Muraíle. You have to be able to work with the original materials as much as possible.
Yeah, so you have a range of skills then at your disposal to tackle this issue. But returning now to, I guess, the meat of the matter, the agency of the Irish kings, can you tell us, well, what would you say were their most effective strategies of consolidating their power, and what were the biggest mistakes that they made in trying to fend off the invaders, the English invaders?
Sure. When you say now, when you talk about consolidating their power, do you mean in relation to each other or after the invasion takes place?
Well, maybe both. Maybe take us from the time of the invasion and.
Okay. So geography played a big role. So, for example, both for Connacht and for Munster, the most important thing was control of the Shannon. You would not the leading dynasty in Connacht was called Shilverdig. They occupied what is today County Roscommon, and the leading dynasty in Munster was Dalgosh, and they occupied what is today County Clare. And such is their proximity to each other and the Shannon on their border as well, that you couldn't have both of these dynasties being powerful at the same time. One or other of them would control the Shannon and manage to keep the other down. So for those provinces in particular, control of the Shannon was one of the most important things. The kings of Munster tended to also look east to make sure that they controlled Leinster as well before they made any steps to control the Midlands, whereas Connacht, when Connacht was powerful, it tried to project itself across the Midlands using the Shannon, so controlling Breffni and Meath, as well as Dalgosh and Clare, before moving either south or north. For the kings of the north, and that's how they refer to themselves, King of the North, in the most powerful regions would have been what is today Tyrone, Derry, Donegal. They were more isolationist than the others, and they tended to view themselves as very powerful when they could defy an external invader, right? So that they were the equal of any other king as long as they could defy an invasion. And they relied on their mountainous terrain and also very heavily forested terrain as well, as a sort of defensive resource. So control of the geography depending on, and also there were only really 2 military passes into their territory in this period, so control of those passes was important as well. So this was the sort of interplay between the three, these are the 3 important kingdoms of the 12th century, Munster, Connacht and the Northern Nael, up to the time of the invasion. They're controlling their weaker eastern neighbours. Then the thing changes dramatically when the English arrive over and establish lordships on the east coast. So the eastern neighbours go from being weaker, controllable territories to being potentially strong, dangerous territories, and the west coast kingdoms have to try and deal with that. And they try different things. Again, there's an element of chance in how it plays out. The English established themselves first in Munster, and so Munster has to, in Leinster, but as an extension of Munster, what I call Leinster and Lethmugga in the book. And so Munster has to try and come to grips with the situation earlier than Connacht or the Northern Nail do. Again, the Northern Nail are a little bit isolationist, and Connacht, what Connacht tries to do is to seek accommodation within the English, the Angevin domains, right? So to get charters for their lands and so on. And that decision is made by a king called Cathal Crovdearg Conchobair. But it doesn't go very well, and ultimately they end up being conquered. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that aggression was one of the keys to success. So the more aggressive kings tended to be more successful on the whole. So the Northern Nail kings, particularly a man called Maynooth University, was very aggressive towards any English attempts to build castles in the surrounds of his kingdom, and his aggression in terms of burning those castles down really did help to stave off English conquest of that territory. And the Northern Nail territory becomes the largest contiguous Gaelic territory into the 13th and 14th century, partially thanks to that decision.
Yeah. And so you do a great job in the book highlighting how it's really not a black and white situation, that there's alliances, as you were saying, they were trying to get charters for their lands, they were trying to kind of get to grips with what was happening. So can you tell us a bit more about how it played out then, kind of post invasion, and how did the political landscape change because of this new English force?
Yeah. So again, sometimes there's an idea of that there was a divide and rule policy on behalf of the invaders, and that they were very successful in dividing the Irish from each other, and that they, meanwhile, were a consolidated force, which is not exactly true, because frequently they were also divided in their aims. And we see this particularly with the reign of King John, when he would make mutually contradictory land grants to his subjects in Irish territory, and therefore he would set them up against each other. So they would sometimes back rival Irish kings, and rival Irish kings would back rival English magnates in order to try and achieve the best outcome for themselves. So there were a lot of machinations, and there's complexity to the warfare of the 13th century as a result of that.
Yeah. That it sounds really complicated to really get to grips with all of this. You're going from roughly the 11th to the 13th century, looking at a variety of sources. How do you decide what to trust? I'm assuming that the sources will perhaps be contradictory in places. How do you decide that a certain source is to be trusted?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose one of the things that leads you to trust the source is that when it's independently backed up by another source. And also, a source tends to be more trustworthy when it mentions something in passing, as opposed to when it's trying to sell you a particular version of events. So when the author of a particular source is clearly making a strong argument in favour of something, or their interests are clearly aligned with something, then we're less inclined to trust what it has to say. But if it mentions in passing that something happened, or it has a less observable interest in what it's saying happened, then we tend to trust it a little bit more. But it's very much a case of incremental steps, and making sure that you don't place too much trust ever in any one particular version of events. Unfortunately, having said that, you are sometimes dependent on one particular source for a great deal of your information, simply because the surviving record is not always as great as we would wish that it would be. And in other places, you have contradictory accounts, which some historians would say, okay, well, there's no getting past the fact that these are contradictory, and others might try and tease out the issue a little bit more and see if there's any way of saying what the balance of probabilities is. So that is not maybe a simple answer, but that's part of the discipline of trying to figure out what's going on, and that's why experts can sometimes differ in their interpretations of events.
And I imagine that's also why it's so interesting to look at all these differing accounts. And
Absolutely. So it's kind of like professional history is kind of like detective work. You're trying to find out something new based on fragmentary evidence. And while we would like for there to be new sources or to discover a new source that told us all about a particular topic, that almost never happens. So you're left working with the same sources that everybody else has also used. So the question is then, how can you use those in a different way, or get them to tell you a different story?
Well, that sounds like a lot of work. And I was wondering also, obviously you mentioned that you were focusing on the historical sources like the Annals and charters, but I know you kind of focused on these for the book, but can you tell us just a bit about how historians would use literary sources, maybe poems or narrative texts? How does that come into play then to understand this time period?
Sure. That's a great question. We often use these types of sources to add colour to our accounts. That's definitely one of their uses. And that is one of the things that's been pointed out to as a flaw of the Irish Annals, that they're very brief descriptions of events, very little personal interest, and it can be hard to get at the personalities of the people involved. So you can use poetry and narrative literature to try and get a little bit closer to the personalities of the people, and to try and explain their actions in a way that's not as cold, maybe not as calculated as you might get the impression just from a realpolitik point of view. The danger, of course, is that you start to trust literary tropes and things that are not really reflective of what actually happened in the past. And so you need to be equally familiar with the themes of these types of sources in order to know how to use them. So to take one example, so there's this famous abduction of an Irish queen, Durbhagil, and in some sources it's characterised as a sort of romantic event where she's connived at her own abduction, and she's described as Ireland's Helen of Troy and so on. And okay, these sources are really interesting to read and to quote and to add, as I say, colour to our narrative. But then when you compare them with the Annals, they're not telling us exactly the same story. So we tend to use both. And I would see the uses of the literary sources as much about keeping some personality and some interest in the narrative as anything else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe stepping back a little bit to think more broadly about your approach to this period of history in your book. So how have using both post-colonial kind of a post-colonial approach and placing 1169, the invasion, at the heart of that time period, how do you think that's changed how you understand medieval Irish history, and how would you, I'm assuming you've perhaps used this in your experience teaching history to students, so how do you think that has an impact on how yourself and perhaps your students as well can understand this better? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I'm not sure there's a simple answer to it. It's quite subtle in the terms of just observing the continuity over time and the gradual changes that occurred that get you from, say, A to B, where we're very familiar with A and we're very familiar with B, but we don't necessarily know how we get from one to the other in terms of historical time period. You can see gradual changes and what we call acculturation, where the Irish are becoming a little bit anglicised and the English in Ireland are becoming a little bit Gaelicised. They're becoming very familiar with each other, and they're I work also with a lot of social history in terms of social practices at the time, like fosterage and marriage. And how those practices are influencing each other. So I think one of the most interesting things that, for me, in terms of what I've looked at, is the influence of the different marriage practices on each other. So the English practice of dowry is incompatible with the Irish covca, and so when Irish and English intermarriages occur, what practices are they following? They don't always tell us. In fact, they almost never tell us. But it's interesting to observe that intermarriages are occurring. So these two different cultures are getting to grips with each other on the ground. So in terms of concretely understanding what it was like for Ireland to transition from a place that was predominantly Gaelic Irish to the Ireland of two nations that we get in the later Middle Ages, there's a lot of detail in terms of what's going on. In terms of teaching that then, I suppose it's to try and get students interested in the topic, try and find some aspect of the topic that they will connect with personally themselves and drive them into further study of it. Those won't necessarily be the same things that interested me when I was looking at it, so it can be difficult to judge exactly what each student would be interested in. But when I'm teaching, I always like to have an environment where students feel that they can interrupt, ask questions or make comments and so on, and we can go down a rabbit hole if people are interested in it, and if that will direct them into some particular avenue that they find particularly interesting.
Yeah, and as we know, at least in our line of work, rabbit holes are a daily occurrence.
Sometimes you never get out.
Exactly. So you've structured, as you mentioned earlier, you structured the book around. You have three chapters, one on Connacht and the Shannon, one on Diarmait in the north, and one on Munster and Lathmogga. And then you follow with two thematic chapters, one on kingship and one on invasion. So can you tell us a bit more about how and why you structured the book that way, and kind of how that reads for you?
Yeah. So I would have preferred, and almost all professional history is based on themes, right? So people like to look up, particular themes and to concentrate on them. Very little professional history is narrative history. Mostly when you see narrative history, it's amateur and it's directed at a popular audience, which is fine. But in this case, there was no reliable narrative of the Irish kingdoms across the period that I wanted to look at. And so I thought it would be pointless to have an entirely thematic focus without having the narrative to back up the points. So if you throughout the book, it's heavily cross-referenced. Because what's happening in one particular page of one chapter is affecting what's in the other chapters. Now, there might perhaps have been other ways to do that, but that's the way I decided to structure it. I also wanted to discuss, part of my argument is that there were effectively three over-kingdoms, three kingdoms that had the prestige to take the position of King of Ireland and no more, that it was not a free-for-all. So I wanted to discuss their power bases, their spheres of influence, their hegemonies, as they're called in the book, and their relationships with one another. So that's why you have Connacht and the Shannon, Munster and Lathmogga, and Diarmait in the north, how they understood themselves and they had these larger alter egos that were in relation and their relationships with one another. So the three narrative chapters then set the stage for the thematic chapters afterwards, where observations are made on the basis of those narrative histories. I suppose the cheat code for reading the book is to read the introduction and then go to the thematic chapters and refer back to the narrative chapters where necessary, based on the footnotes and the cross references. But that's why I structured it in the way I did.
No, and I think it works really well, I've not finished the whole book yet, but I've read parts of it, and it does read really well to have an actual kind of more or less chronological account to understand how, as you said, how it went from A to B and how that worked in geographical areas, even if it obviously impacts, when you're reading about Connacht, obviously impacting Munster, and it links with Ulster. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think that works really well, and I would recommend anyway to our listeners. So yeah, now I wanted to talk a little bit about the book itself. I understand it's partly based on your PhD thesis. So can you tell us maybe what it was like to turn a PhD thesis into a book, and kind of how did it go for you? Was it a complete rewrite, or did you kind of start from somewhere already?
Sure, yeah. Well, maybe the first thing I'd like to say about that is that I want to pay tribute to Liverpool University Press, and the two people I worked most closely with were Claire Litt and Alice Tradewell there, and they were really brilliant in sort of guiding me through the process. The conversion from PhD to book, yeah, there was a lot of different elements to it. Some chapters were removed entirely. Others were restructured, and then other elements were moved from one place to another, which had an impact on the narrative, and then certain sections had to be rewritten in order to reshape it. I suppose the idea is to make it less dependent on pre-existing specialist knowledge, so that you can read it without already being a specialist. I mean, you can assume when you write a PhD that the person who's going to read it is going to already be a specialist in your topic. You can assume a certain amount of expertise on their part already. So you don't want that necessarily with the book, even though the book is largely based at an academic, targeted at an academic audience. You still want it to be accessible to people from adjacent fields and subfields, so that they can use it for their own sources. People, for example, who might work purely with literary sources and want to place their sources in a particular historical context should be able to look at this book and say, oh, well, it fits in there or it doesn't fit in there. So it has to be accessible from that point of view. And also then the other thing about it is that you kind of get better as a researcher and as a writer over the course of time that you're doing the work, and it takes a long time to write a PhD and then longer again to convert it into a book. So that by the time you're getting towards the end of the process, the chapters that were the earliest ones that you wrote are not necessarily up to the standard of the other ones. So you have to rewrite then and try and make everything look consistent in terms of quality throughout. So there's an element of that to it as well. So it's it can be an involved process to get it there, but a rewarding one. I would say that I enjoyed the process overall, and I enjoyed writing it when I was a PhD, and I enjoyed converting it because it's a topic that sustained my interest throughout the time. There was never a time when I was working on it that I stopped being interested in what I was writing about, and I think that was really important to the success of the project overall. Yeah, no, for sure. There's nothing worse than just losing interest in what you're writing about. And so, did you change your mind on certain things when you were kind of going through it again after finishing the PhD and putting it into a book? Were there things that changed that you were like, oh, actually, I don't think that's what happened? Oh, in terms of actual historical events?
Yeah.
Not so much in terms of actual historical events, but I did change my mind frequently enough about how to structure the book and sort of on the meta level, how to organise things and what things would be best placed in what position, whether I should talk about my methodology for the book before the historiographical review or vice versa and so on. So I mean, I don't know if those kinds of things really are of interest to anyone except myself, but I had internal debates as I was trying to sort out what the best way of organising those things.
All right. And so is there anything that you found particularly challenging in the process of writing this book?
Particularly challenging. Well, besides the structure. Well, of course, getting to grips with such a large period of time.
Yeah.
And balancing the extent of the change over that time with the desire for this particular project to be focused on continuity. So if this project had got lost in the change that occurred, which definitely did occur, then it wouldn't have worked as an independent project. This project had to be focused on the continuity across the time period. So finding a way to present the information in a way that achieved what I wanted to achieve for the argument was probably the thing that challenged me most consistently over the course of the project. And trying to write accurately and precisely, but also not to entirely lose the colour from the topic, is something that I at least attempted, but certainly something that I feel I still have to work more on in future projects. I think that as a field, that we probably don't do enough to try and engage the interest of general readership, and that we have affected a certain sterile quality in our writing that we feel is professional, but in so doing have lost some of the interest that would draw in a more general readership. And I think we can do better. So I hope that that's something that we can improve on in the future.
And well, speaking of colour then, is there a particular anecdote or a favourite king that you have that you could tell us about to lure people into this book?
Well, my master's thesis was about the assassination of a king called Tiernan O'Rourke, who had a long and violent career, and was assassinated at a parley with the English Baron Hugh de Lacy in 1172, which the Irish sources claim was done treacherously, and which the English sources claim that O'Rourke acted treacherously. So it's exactly the type of contradictory source that we were talking about early on. I have a soft spot for this particular story because I spent a full year trying to work out the various details of it. And also Tiernan O'Rourke was a very important person who came from a province which was not very powerful at the time he took over, and he managed to make great strides and great achievements with it. Having said that, he was extremely violent, murderous individual who did many terrible things. So to have a favourite is perhaps not the right way to put it, but I would at least say that I am particularly interested in his career.
Very good, very good. Maybe kind of following on from that, was there anything, knowing that it's a highly colourful period with, as you said, a lot of violent things happening, but was there anything that surprised you in what those sequence of events? Any particular historical fact or?
Yeah, the thing that surprised me the most is the fact that nothing really was inevitable. There was no reason for any of it necessarily to happen, and it's at least I think the general impression is that if the English invasion of Ireland had not happened at that time, maybe it would have happened at another time, that it was an event that was waiting to happen. But from what I've seen in the source material, looking at it over such a long period of time, I don't think that it was inevitable at all. And it can be very striking sometimes the way that circumstances conspire, and chance and geography and all sorts of other factors play into to create a perfect storm, and how a crisis can accelerate dramatically, depending on what happens. Yeah.
All right. So maybe kind of drawing this to a close now. Now that your beautiful red book is out, do you have any further plans? Maybe, as you mentioned, writing for a more general audience. Would that be something you'd be interested in? Or?
Yeah, so hopefully I will eventually get around to that. At the moment, I've been commissioned to write a book on Irish queens and queenship in the Central Middle Ages by Palgrave. So I'm preparing material for that at the moment. But as I mentioned to you at the start of the interview, my time here is drawing towards a close. So a part of my time is at the moment is devoted towards trying to find a permanent academic position or another postdoctoral position. I don't have too much good to say about the academic job market at the moment, but I certainly would like to express my solidarity with all my comrades in the postdoctoral job market. So that's partly where my work is at the moment.
Yeah, I think any postdoctoral researcher or anyone who has gone through this period of time in their life will understand the plight of postdoctoral research projects of 1 or 2 years and another place and another place.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we hope anyway that you'll find a great position, and Thanks. With another book in the works, it can only get better from this.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Neil.
So yeah, was there maybe anything else that you wanted to mention? Anything, any reading recommendations, anything for our listeners who might be more interested in this?
Sure. So it depends exactly what kind of reading recommendations or what kind of aspects of the topic people might be interested in. I would always recommend the work of Catherine Sims in particular. She has a book that came out not too long ago called Gaelic Ulster in the Middle Ages, which is really a fantastic book. Also the work of Marie-Therese Flanagan, of Sean Duffy, of Bart Yaski, Paul McCotter. These are some of the real big names. Anthony Camden also. I'm inevitably now going to forget some really important people if I start listing off names. But I suppose you can always consult the bibliography of the book or of any of these works to find some really, really interesting articles. And a lot of it is generally accessible today as well.
All right. Well, that's very exciting, and congratulations again on this wonderful achievement. I think it really reads well, and as a person who's worked on literature more than anything in that period, it kind of finally sets things into place, and I finally understand how we got from there to another place, and how my literary sources fit within the historical period. So thank you for that.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me onto the podcast.
Well, thanks. And so with this, a new episode of Niansa will hopefully come out in the next little while. So thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to Ní Ansa, the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. If you're interested in learning more about today's topic, check out the description below. If you want more information about the school, go to dias.ie. More episodes are coming your way soon. Slán!